Hi, everyone. My name is Labake Fakunle, and I'm delighted today to be talking about the Global Collective for Study Abroad Researchers and Administrators Q&A session. And I'm just recording this session on the topic decolonization and internationalization. And I just flipped that, the internationalization and decolonization. I'm a Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Edinburgh, and this is the area of my research into internationalization of higher education, employability as well, but more on inclusivity in internationalization, and that includes decolonization, which is the focus of what I'll be talking about today. So, a brief overview. I'm going to just look at the definitions of internationalization and also examine decolonization and trying to bring the two together. In terms of definitions of internationalization, the most widely used definition, I would say, is by the one from DeWitt and colleagues. And you can see on the screen, I hope you can see my screen, they actually capture the mainstream definition of internationalization, mainly as an organizational process, as a process where universities rightly integrate the international, the intercultural or global dimension into the purpose functions. I'm reading that now, death by PowerPoint, but it involves what universities really do. Because when we talk about the intentional process of integrating, we could break that down into how is it intentional if it's not strategic? But that is a whole different conversation. But for the purpose of this discussion, I'm taking this as the macro level organizational process, as has been written in the literature, and this tails down to the economic, political, academic, cultural, and social rationales. And this has been widely written by DeWitt and by other key scholars in the field of internationalization. But what is missing in the centering of the organization in internationalization? The voices of students. And as I wrote in this piece, student mobility is the most visible aspect of internationalization. That's not surprising. Over 6 million mobile students are right now studying abroad. So, of necessity, it drives the interest of scholars and it drives the interest of countries because international students contribute so much money to the coffers of institutions and countries. But to what extent are these voices reflected when we talk about internationalization strategies? So, merging the rationales, as I've earlier spoken about, the macro level rationales and the micro level rationales shows similarities and also distinctions. And, this is all in the literature. This is just a quick overview. But one key thing I would point out is the experiential rationale for internationalization that students just want to experience. I think this is something that we seen to be totally alien, to an organizational perspective, that you just want to experience for the fun of experience. Organizations have goals, have strategies, they have to deliver stuff. And this is where there are tensions, across the rationales. But having these tensions, and of course, there's the aspirational, I should say, the aspirations of students, to be more than what they are. I suppose in a way, higher education institutions are aspirational as well. That's where they do research, they ref and all that, but not from the personal perspective. I would just then take us to a possibility of integrating these macro and micro rationales, because this is very important in the sense that an integrated and inclusive and holistic approach would encompass what parts different stakeholders, have or contribute to the processes of internationalization. And we can look at the individual approach from the point of view of students, faculty, practitioners, and administrators. Whereas we need the organizational approach, of course, to understand how institutions, arrange that process, as well as what the inputs, which of necessity must come in at the national level. So, looking at the different manifestations of internationalization in terms of mobility, which I've talked about, which is very much talked about, but not limited to that. There is also internationalization of the curriculum, and that just involves all the activities, to make the curriculum international. For example, including different examples, international examples in the learning or pedagogical materials. And of course, there is internationalization at home, which initially came about as a sort of reaction, I would say, to mobility, in the sense that most students do not leave their home countries to study abroad. The majority, of students would stay at home. And for those students, how can they benefit also from an international education? So, but more recently, like Jones and Berlin, they write about internationalization at home in the sense of it being for everybody, for all students who are studying in a particular location. This is still much seen in the Western front, but at least there is an acknowledgement that internationalization at home is for all students within that particular context and even outside of it. There is, of course, transnational education, TNA, as widely known, is also gaining a lot of momentum, certainly in the UK and elsewhere. COVID. We really can now talk about international education without mentioning the pandemic that really accelerated the digitalization of education, which of course we've always had, but that's necessity, to make that front and center of all we did for the past 2 years, 3 years now. And now we're coming out of that, but it's still very implicated and it's still a very new and developing field. So I put together this definition of internationalization as the participation of an individual, taking account of the genetic, of institution or nation, taking account of the organizational or the structural level, in what? An internationalized learning, teaching, research, or service undertaking within or across international borders, which takes into account mobility to a host destination from, home, as well as when that is happening within the national borders. When you talk of internationalization at home, when you talk of internationalizing the curriculum. So with that in mind, I want to just briefly talk about a recent paper also by leading scholars in the field that talks about globality in internationalization for universities to understand their role in the global society. But that still begs the question, globality in internationalization and decolonization, are they the same thing? I think not, because normative accounts of internationalization, which I write about as well, has its place in trying to understand that as a process. But when we go beyond that and we look at the critical aspects of internationalization in terms of what we call historical patterns, the global flow, from the so-called global south to the global north, and how that mirrors some historical and colonial trends. So that's still kind of implicated in internationalization, but not limited to that, because the global flow is, north to south, south to north, south to south, north to north. So it's not limited. It's just about degrees, really, in terms of what is the more prevalent forms. And we know that the top destination countries, of course, the US, the UK, Australia, Canada, they're in the West, Germany as well. So globality in internationalization is not internationalization or decolonization, pardon me. And then what is decolonization? I like how data frames it as an ongoing process of becoming, unlearning and relearning who we are as researcher, as educator, and also taking responsibility for participants. Of course, data here referred to participants in research, looking at indigenous communities and anthropological studies about those communities and the settler colonialism and all that, area of literature, which is not actually my focus. But this definition is actually very helpful in the sense that when we talk about becoming what? Data still cites this, it's about this processes, when you understand how colonization came to be, the history behind it, and how it's still manifesting now. And what's our relationship with that? What's my relationship with that, as someone who is from a former colonized country? Or what's the relation of people, living in formal, colonial masters, so to speak? But as a researcher and educator, do we even understand this pattern? Do we have a clue about this history? How well informed are we? And are we in that process of becoming a lifelong learner that understands these processes? And as part of that process of becoming, we have to take account of how are we going to unlearn, what I describe here, widely described really, as the hegemonic attribution of knowledge and being who you are, your being, through Western epistemologies of frames of knowing. And also unlearning the disqualification of, non-Western knowledge as not being valid. Unlearning that as a conscious process, that there are different forms of knowledge. And difference is not necessarily deficit. So how do we unlearn, the attribution of what is knowledge to a particular school of thought, to a Western Eurocentric model of knowing? And we cannot just unlearn and create a vacuum. What do we fill with that vacuum? And that's the process of relearning. And I like this quote, I would use this also by data, in that, how do you develop decolonizing skills that can help to, have a critical perspective about working with people, working with community perspective, collaborative decision-making. And this would reflect in even everything we do. It will reflect in our teaching, our research, and in how we engage with researchers working in the global north, in the global south, or wherever, and recognize our place and our roles and what we need to do to be decolonial. And why decolonization? Decolonization has come up, now it's a real buzzword. It's something that people might use as an add-on. It's something everybody seems to have an opinion about or want to know more about. But to what extent are we dismantling the dangerous legacies of colonialism? And this re-energized, calls for decolonization in universities across the world. To what extent is it changing practices? We wrote a piece recently, myself and some colleagues, and we asked internationalization decolonization in the UK higher education. Are we there yet? And we no, because the university strategies do not explicitly take this into account. So if we want to think of internationalization from a decolonial approach, how do we do it? I would like this, Chassis article in University World News talks about understanding and or recognizing that the whole colonial project is still implicated in internationalization by the centraling, by the domination of global North perspectives in the definitions, in the concepts, in the practices of internationalization. And, Santos, in a well-known book, Epistemologies of the South, talks about the validity of different knowledges and perceptions, which must be assessed. So it's not taking knowledge from anywhere for the sake of knowledge, but understanding that knowledge cannot be disqualified simply because it's not Western. And knowing or understanding or recognizing and on the way to accepting that the future can be found at the crossroads of different knowledges and different technologies. That is working together in partnership. And I just, in kind of summarizing all of that, decolonial internationalization requires a conscious and intentional reevaluation. There has to be a reevaluation first, a reassessment of what we consider to be knowledge, a reassessment of our epistemologies, and a centering of historical and present day, because it still continues, this marginalization of voices. And not just knowing that, but embedding a humanizing ethos in our engagement with different knowledges and in our teaching, our research, and in our engagement with other people. With people we work with the students we recruit, if we're recruiting, like the international office, but a reassessment of this relationship and to humanize these processes. And why do we need to do that, or how can we do that? I have some few points about adopting a decolonial approach. First, we need to be aware of the challenges. We need to be aware of the histories, because without that, what is even the basis of us seeking to unlearn or to relearn? We need to critically reflect on the Western hegemonic knowledge frameworks, because if we've taken a lot of things, on questioning, then it can be difficult for us to even think that there is anything that needs to be done. So we need to take that step. And that really, really would stem from our attitude. Attitude is so important here. Attitude is important in the sense that from going from, point one, in terms of that awareness, that recognition of the challenges, what needs to be done, to that point of having the attitude to say that, yes, I'm prepared to unlearn, and I'm also happy to relearn. And that attitude is something, each has to fashion out for themselves. And to draw on the diversity of knowledges, because when we are ready to relearn, then we are ready to embrace other forms of being, other forms of knowledges, and not just one way of doing things all the time. And critically, we need to humanize these processes, because really, these lives are involved there literally. So we need to humanize the process. How do we humanize the processes involved in internationalization? That it's not just transactional as it could be. And there is a lot of good things going on, in internationalization, in terms of opening up. People have written about that, you know, the experiential, the once in a lifetime opportunity for some people to actually go abroad to study, aside from the academics. It's a life-changing, you know, life-changing endeavor for a lot of people. To what extent do we recognize that human aspect of internationalization and not just, you know, look at the economic rationale and all of that? I've been thinking a lot, you know, in my own work, that how do we even reconcile these two? How do we work and make this work? And I've been reading, you know, or this approach, like Bell Hooks, who talks about love in terms of a new vision, in terms of a valid vision, you know, and rigorously sound vision, not just something mushy about feelings, but actually how love can be at the center of what we can do to reimagine this terrain. Now, at first, when I read that, I was taken aback that, oh gosh, how can I even begin to say this? But really, how do we undergo this process of learning or unlearning and relearning? How do we undergo it? We have to be at the place where our attitude is right and where we're really seeking to intentionally decolonize internationalization. And so on that note, I would say I'm really looking forward, you know, to all those who could come on 17th May to have the Q&A session and to kind of possibly go through a process of learning and unlearning together, because it's a journey, it's not a destination. And decolonization is not a metaphor that has been written, you know, and acknowledged already. But how do we be part of this? What is our role? How do we reflectively, you know, work on this? And what pathways can lead us to actually reimagining the terrain? So on that note, I would say thank you so much for listening, and Eshe Pupo, which is thank you in Yoruba. See you tomorrow. Bye.